Welcome, friends. My name is David Sevitt, and this is the Jazz Mind podcast, where we explore the fundamental pillars of jazz with innovators in the field. My objective with this podcast is to surface ideas and insights that transcend jazz and are transferable to other disciplines. My belief is the building blocks of jazz, innovation, collaboration, improvisation, and risk-taking, offer pathways to more meaningful and richer lives. And my attempt with this podcast is to illuminate these building blocks in a manner that's useful and hopefully inspiring. For our first episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with Virginia MacDonald, a rising star in the international jazz scene and someone who's bringing tremendous innovation to jazz clarinet. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Virginia, with everything going on in the world, climate change, war, recently a global pandemic, why is live music important?
Oh, wow. I think it extends further than live music and even music, and it's just art in general. I think if we go back through history, when we go through perilous events, catastrophic events as a society, what we turn to a lot of the time is art and a form of expression. And so I think when these things happen, we need an outlet and we need a place to go either as creators or consumers. And art and music can be so visceral in that sense. And so it gives us that sense of release that we need, I think, when we're experiencing these things, these unknown circumstances. So, yeah.
Is there something about music in particular that provides a certain type of release or relief from some of these events that we all find ourselves having to contend with?
I think it's just such a pure form of expression. And it's something that you feel, you hear it, especially with live music, you see it, so you're part of the experience, but you feel it so much. And, just being in the room with other people, I think, especially after the pandemic, was so important for both audience members and band members, performers alike. It's been interesting the past couple of years as things have kind of returned to whatever our normal is right now, being on stage, performing, playing a set, and having a lot of audience members coming up to me afterwards and saying, this is my first live show. Since the pandemic, I haven't seen live music in a year or 2 years, and, I'm really, really grateful for this. I really needed this. So I think that we're all kind of looking, even still after things have kind of opened back up, for that sense of community, that sense of being able to share experiences with each other. And I think that music is such a great way to do that and have that experience.
Oh, that's amazing that people are expressing their gratitude for you helping build community. Mm-hmm. That's amazing.
And that's kind of what it's all about for me as well. Obviously I play music for myself because I love it. I mean, I don't really remember a time in my life that I wasn't playing music, but for me, music is nothing if you're not sharing it with other people. So, to have that feedback, that instant kind of affirmation that, this means something to someone or it's important to someone, or, just being able to know that maybe you uplifted someone even for a couple of hours. That, to me, is kind of the important thing.
Oh, that's wonderful.
For sure, yeah.
I'm curious as to how you identify as a musician. I know some musicians very much identify with their instruments, right? So certain people might consider themselves first and foremost piano players or saxophone players. And I think other people identify more with a genre of music, like I'm a jazz musician or a classical or a rock musician. Like where on that continuum do you find yourself?
It's interesting, I've kind of been thinking about this a lot recently. I mean, first and foremost, I feel like I just identify as a human being on this earth. And it's difficult when you're an artist. It's so hard to not let that part of you get tied up in your identity as a person. So, that's very important to me, to kind of distinguish that I'm a person who plays music. And that part of my life is so important, but it's not everything, if that makes sense.
A person first.
Yeah, person first. Absolutely. Because, to a lot of people, consumers, people who listen to our music, people who consume our art, we are that artist or that kind of figure. And people kind of forget what's behind that a lot of the time. But in terms of how I view myself as a musician, I've talked a little bit about this before, but obviously my medium, what I do is I'm a clarinet player. I play jazz music first and foremost, and I have for most of my life. But what I like to say is that clarinet is just the instrument or the vehicle in which I can express my voice, or through which I can express my voice. So, that music and that sense of music and that feeling for music would be there. And it just so happened that clarinet was the instrument that I gravitated towards when I was 6 years old. And then that's kind of where my journey has taken me.
Is there something about the clarinet in particular that allows you to express yourself in a way that other instruments might not otherwise have allowed you to do? Is there a reason why you gravitated to the clarinet?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of a funny story. I mean, my dad is a jazz musician, so he's a jazz saxophone player. And so I started taking music lessons when I was very, very young. And I kind of had the sound of music as a present in my life since I was born. So, when it came time for me to enroll in music lessons, I think what had happened is my dad had laid out a bunch of different instruments. So I think there was a clarinet, there's a saxophone, there was a flute, piano, guitar, and
I can picture the table.
Yeah. So for whatever reason, when I saw the clarinet, my eyes just lit up, and I thought, oh my God, that's such a cool looking instrument. And so that started my journey. And so that was about 22 years ago. So, at that time, you don't really have that cognizance like, oh, I'm going to be playing this the rest of my life. I just thought that it was such a beautiful instrument. And it's interesting because at the time I didn't really realize that, maybe the lineage of clarinet is quite a bit smaller than a lot of instruments when it comes to where it fits in the kind of scope of jazz music. And so as I got older, I kind of became more aware of that. But I thought, I really love this instrument, and I want to see if there's something that I can do with this. And, I think when there's a will, there's a way. And I just loved playing so much, and I loved the clarinet so much that I thought, I'm going to have to find a way to make this work for myself.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the differences between good and great, not only in jazz and in life generally, and curious as to how you think about what separates world-class jazz musicians or jazz bands from the merely great jazz bands. Are there certain characteristics, ingredients that differentiate the two?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I think that the things that differentiate the good and great can often be very, very subtle, and it has a lot to do with the nuance, the details. The way that I look at this music is kind of akin to how we think about languages. So, this music to me is a continuum and a tradition in a lot of ways. So I find that the people who have done their work, who have studied, who have really taken the time to learn the language, to immerse themselves in the language, these are the people who tend to go further and further along the path towards greatness, whatever that may mean. And the hard thing is that it's so subjective. It's different for every type of musician, and I think that I play a genre where there's a lot of different umbrellas. There's a lot of different things going on. So one person's definition of great might not be another person's definition of great. But I think a lot of the time it has to do with respect for the tradition, for the music, and it has to do with putting in hours. I think one thing that all of the great musicians that come to mind, for me at least, have in common is spending hours and hours and hours practicing and honing their craft, trying to be a better musician. And I think the other common thread is, getting out there and playing with as many great musicians as possible. One thing that I find really interesting that sometimes I see with my own students, or just, from doing a lot of master classes in universities and colleges, is this hesitance to not be the best in the room. So I find that a lot of people struggle sometimes to play with a band where they might be the worst person in that band. No one really likes that experience of being the worst in the room or the worst in any situation. I don't think that has to do with just music, right? It's like a very human thing. But to me, playing this music, I think there needs to be some sense of humbleness and being able to humble yourself. And that's when you can truly be in that space of growth. And I think that that's another thing, too, that I've noticed with all of the musicians that I look up to. That willingness to make mistakes, to learn, and to be free in the sense that they're not judging themselves. And when you're playing with musicians who are better than you, of course, you're going to grow and you're going to learn something from that. So I don't know if that...
Well, what I love about that is what you didn't say. You didn't talk about being born with certain qualities. Like you talked about things that are within people's control, hard work, getting out there, being humble, taking risks to play with, better musicians, learn from those experiences. Like I love that these are all things that people can do if they choose to.
Yeah, they're very tangible things. And I do think that, of course, there's always going to be these people who are just born with a natural gift. That always exists. And again, not just in music, but even still, you can be gifted and put in the work. I remember watching or listening to an interview with Charlie Parker and how he talked about practicing sometimes for 15 hours a day. And, this is someone who's obviously considered one of, if not the very best of all time, someone who had very, very natural talent, but again, still worked very, very hard to achieve whatever his goals were. So, it's about discipline as well, I think, and, trusting in the process.
Yeah, I remember similar to what my old piano teacher, guy named Steve Amiro, who I took lessons with when I was living in Montreal, told me about, growing up and not being the most talented kid, but having worked harder than everyone else and eventually surpassing his peers. I always found that very inspiring, that fundamentally it's a question of hard work and putting in the hours.
Yeah, dedication.
So jazz is at its best a live art form. Tell me about a particularly memorable live experience you had. Might have been your favorite show. Is there one that comes to mind as being memorable for whatever reason?
Yeah, it's funny. I get asked this question so many times, and I feel like every time I get asked it, the answer changes because there's so many beautiful experiences and memories that I have that just kind of come into my head. But the one that kind of comes to mind today, for whatever reason, is right before the pandemic. I was really, really lucky to go over to India with my dad's band, actually. And so we do a lot of work together. We play together. And it's one of the greatest joys of my life is being able to share the stage with my dad. And so we traveled to India. And this was quite literally about a week before everything shut down in 2020. So, it was my first time going anywhere in Asia, and we took a plane over, and it was like 16 hours, and we were absolutely exhausted. But I remember we played at a jazz festival in Jaipur, and there's a really, really large audience, by my standards at least. I think there was around 1,000 people there. It was a beautiful Jaipur is
That's
also
big for a jazz audience.
It was a beautiful city as well, and so we were on this beautiful outdoor stage, and the weather was just great. And I just remember thinking, like this, there's something really, really special about this, being able to go anywhere in the world and having this common thread of connection with people who you might not share a language with, you might not share anything else with, literally. And so there's been so many experiences like that in my life where I go to a new country and being able to connect with people who I probably never would have met or connected with otherwise. And so being able to do that in India was a really, really cool experience for me.
That's amazing.
Very special.
Yes,
Yeah.
music, the universal language.
Yeah, it is. It is.
What did you take away from that experience? Were there any lasting learnings, insights that you continue to draw on?
I think just that, wherever you go, music heals people, and that's kind of cool. I find that music heals me when I play it, and I just know from speaking to so many audience members that it heals other people as well. And I know that's a little bit abstract, but one really cool experience about that whole trip was the bass player. It's a great Canadian bass player, Neil Swainson, who's played
Amazing.
with everyone under the sun. But he had a really long working stint with George Shearing. They collaborated and worked together a lot. And so I remember we did a master class in India, and this really young bass player came up to Neil, and he was such a big fan. And he was going, "Oh my God, I've listened to all of your recordings with George Shearing. I can't even tell you how much you've impacted me, and how much your music means to me." And so just to see that was so interesting. India, obviously, it's a big country with a huge population, but jazz is not one of the most prevalent music that is listened to over there. So to see this young bass player who was probably 19, 20, who was so deep into the music and had heard of Neil and had listened to all of his albums, I just thought that was really, really cool too. So, music inspires people, it heals people, but it also connects people. And I think maybe that's kind of my takeaway. Going to all of these different countries and places in the world, it's interesting how that thread kind of continues wherever you go.
Let's talk about improvisation.
Okay.
Why is it so hard for particularly people starting out with an instrument? What is it about improvisation that's challenging for a lot of people?
That's a good question. It's improvisation is interesting. So I think when it comes to jazz music, what I see, because I teach a lot, is a lot of people coming in to maybe a space where they're improvising for the first time or they're not totally familiar with it, with a lot of misconceptions about what it means. And so I talked about this before, but, coming back to this idea that this music is a language. Mm-hmm. So if you were learning a language, you wouldn't start stringing together random syllables and sounds and trying to make a sentence out of them. You would be learning pieces of vocabulary. You would be learning phrases, sentences, how the grammar works, right? All of these things. And so I get a lot of students who come in and they go, "Oh my God, what am I supposed to do? I just have to sit down and play something and create something out of thin air." And I think that this is kind of a misconception. And so that style of improvisation absolutely does exist, and there's a space for it. But when it comes to, maybe playing over jazz standards, like Great American Songbook standards, or standards by people like John Coltrane or Charlie Parker or Joe Henderson, when we listen to recordings of these people playing or great jazz musicians, it's coming from... what they're doing is coming from some kind of vernacular or vocabulary, right? And so I think that people are just so overwhelmed when they start thinking about improvising that they just don't really know how to start. And so that's kind of what I see with a lot of my students, at least. It's just I don't know what to do. The scope seems so large. But really, and I truly believe this, anyone can improvise. It's absolutely possible for anyone, given experience on their instrument and, they have that kind of foundation. It is doable, but I think it comes from letting go a little bit, learning to trust in the moment, not judging yourself, but then also, the practical thing of being able to listen to a lot of music, listen to a lot of jazz music, immerse yourself in the music, and spend the time learning this language that you're learning.
Yeah,
right?
I love this idea of thinking about it as a language. So would a practical application be, for someone listening, maybe struggling a little bit with improvisation, is like learning a new language. If I wanted to learn Spanish, like learn a few words, like break it down into some, and like what's the equivalent of a few words in jazz? Is that a few phrases?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we call this in jazz transcribing, right? So, if we're listening to, let's say, I don't know, Lee Morgan recording and it's on a standard, we go, okay, wow, I really, really like this solo. He's playing some really great lines. I love the ideas that he's playing on this recording. What we do is we do something called transcribing. So that can either mean learning the whole solo that he just played by ear, or it can mean actually notating it rhythmically, so writing everything down, writing down the notes, and then kind of learning the solo like that. So it can take on a few different forms. And so by transcribing, what we do is we kind of start to get these pieces of vocabulary into our own playing. And so once we kind of get a few phrases, then we can expand upon those phrases, and we can also kind of learn how to make them our own. And so that's the other thing too, is you learn from other people to kind of get to know yourself and your own musical voice. These things don't exist in a vacuum. You can't just pick up a musical instrument after not listening to jazz and say, I'm going to be a great jazz musician, or I'm going to be a great jazz improviser. For me, this music, it comes from listening and really being immersed in it, or at least, kind of getting to where you want to be. That's where it comes from, for me, at least.
You talked a minute ago about the importance of letting go.
Yeah.
That might be easier said than done.
Absolutely.
For certain people. Mm-hmm. So how do you get to that place? Thinking about questions of mindset, or can it be learned to let go?
Absolutely. I think it can. I kind of have my own experience with this. Like, it's funny. I've told this story before. When I was in high school, because I went to a community music program, Humber College Community Music School, and so, the whole idea is that you played in ensembles, and we would do some performances throughout the year. And I remember I was so nervous that I would take the music stand and I would literally put it in front of my face so no one could see me. So was I in the moment? Was I letting go? Absolutely not. I was definitely really scared. I had really bad performance anxiety and, stage anxiety. So it's a learned thing, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing is just doing it over and over again, right? And so this doesn't just go for performance, it just goes for playing in general. Again, I see this a lot with students, or, sometimes younger musicians, even older musicians too. You might be on stage and you're having what you think is not a good night, and it's all perception. And so once you kind of have that in your head, like, oh, I'm really not playing well tonight, or, oh, this isn't going well, then that's when things can really start to go downhill very quickly. And it's funny, I've had nights like that myself where I think, oh, okay, it's just one of those nights. And then, you listen back and you go, wait a second, this actually sounds quite good. Compared to what was going on in my mind, at least. So I think letting go, it comes from not judging yourself in the moment. And if you're judging yourself when you're playing, especially when you're improvising, it's impossible to let go in any way. You need to be able to kind of submit to what's happening on stage. So, you have to remember as well that this music is not a solo act. It's about interaction. It's about playing with the people who are on stage with you, considering the audience that you're playing for. And so sometimes it's easy to kind of get stuck in that oneness where you're in your head and you're only thinking about
that's really interesting.
About yourself.
Like
but
thinking about the collective might be as a strategy almost to get out of your own head.
Absolutely, because it's not just a strategy. It's really what you should be doing. I think if
What you should be doing.
Absolutely, yeah, because, again.
But it also helps.
It does help. For sure.
Side effect, yeah.
Yeah, listening to what's going on around you. So letting go, absolutely important. I mean, that's how you get to that space of transcendence as a performer. And I think that for most of us, at least, that's what we're going for on some level. But you can't do that if you're judging yourself.
Transcendence, that's a worthy goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
Yeah.
How do you practice improvisation?
So it's very different for everyone. And my routine fluctuates all the time. I mean, it's interesting. Like I said, I started playing clarinet when I was 7 years old. And so it's been just over 20 years now. So my practice routine has changed, obviously, from then until now, but also in different periods of my life. In terms of how I practice, it changes a lot. What I find is, and I'm very grateful for this at this point, I'm quite busy in my career and I do a lot of work as a side person. So, meaning that I'll be playing in someone else's band. And so what that usually requires or means is I will be looking at a lot of their music. So a lot of my practice sessions involve looking at other people's music, kind of going through it. So learning the melodies, looking at the chord changes to their music in particular, and, kind of thinking, okay, how am I going to navigate through this? A lot of my practice, and I call this practice because I really do think it is listening. So, practice does not necessarily mean sitting down with your instrument and spending time on your instrument. Listening can be just as, if not more important. So listening to albums and not passively, like you would on the TTC or wherever, driving to work, listening to your car radio, but actually really sitting down and listening to an album. And then, just like other practices, probably for other things like dance, whatever, any other kind of art, a lot of rudimentary things, so exercises, patterns that I might be trying to work out in different keys, things like that, and a lot of transcribing. Okay, so, looking at different solos and trying to learn them. So it's kind of random for me. There's a lot of people who have a bit more structure to their practice sessions, but are
there any rituals that you have that persist?
No, I'm pretty random in what I do. And that's just what's worked for me. I think that sometimes when you create a plan, you get tied to it. And if things don't go according to plan, then that can be a little bit frustrating. So I set loose plans and goals for myself, like on a daily basis. I say, I'd like to work on these things today. I'd like to get this done if I can. But I try not to be stuck to a plan or something too rigid, because I find that that's when, if you have those expectations, like, oh, I'm going to practice for 6 hours today and I need to do this. If it doesn't happen, that's when you can get discouraged.
In technology, we call it agile. Or like sprints.
Okay.
But it allows you not to get tied to one thing for too long, and you can pivot and iterate if the circumstances change.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
How has becoming a master jazz musician enriched your life more broadly beyond the music itself?
Oh boy! Well, first of all, I don't think I would call myself a master jazz musician, but I appreciate that. I think I'm just on the path. Everyone is on their own journey, and everyone kind of gets to where they need to go at their own pace and in their own time. So master, maybe one day.
Highly accomplished.
But even that, I appreciate it. I guess it's relative for me. But I will say, how has being a jazz musician enriched my life? I say this really often, that this music has opened so many doors for me, and it's brought me to so many places that I never thought would be possible. Quite on a literal sense, being able to travel to different countries across the world, share my music with people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people over so many different nights, and, just making those connections. That to me is what this is all about. So that's a huge part of it. And, I think if you play this music long enough, and if you care about it and you really, really love what you do, it'll open doors anyway. You don't need to be a master jazz musician to get to that point, if that makes sense. Because if you love anything and you dedicate all of your time to it, or most of your time to it, I think that you will get to where you need to be. But for me, that has looked like getting to play with musicians that I grew up listening to. There's so many amazing, truly master musicians who, I listened to as like a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, and I've gotten to record with them. I've gotten to play live with them. So that, to me, has been one of the biggest honors and joys of my career so far, for sure. Yeah.
Are there one or two musicians that you'd like to share, that you listened to growing up, that you
there's
treasured?
So many at this point. Harold Mayburn was a huge one for me. Jeffrey Keezer, Rodney Whitaker, all of these amazing musicians, and then amazing musicians here in Canada too. Neil Swainson, Pat LaBarbera, Terry Clark. So it's,
legends.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I feel lucky every time I go out on stage. It's not easy. That doesn't mean that this is an easy career or an easy path by any means, but I do have that sense of gratitude, I think, that is there in everything that I do. And so, music has really enriched my life in that sense. It's made me a very grateful person.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I want to talk about risk for a moment.
Okay.
So, my belief is that improvisation, almost by definition, involves some degree of risk-taking.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about a time, maybe during a live performance, when you took a risk, stepped a little bit further outside your comfort zone, and what happened, and maybe what did you learn from it?
This is a hard one, because I'd like to think at least that every time I'm playing, I'm taking a risk of some sort. I think that in the music that we play, there's always variables. There's always new things. Even if you're playing the same songs that you've played hundreds of times, there's always that element of things being new. You might be playing with different people. You might be, in a different space. You might not have the exact same sound setup that you had somewhere else. So there's always that element of like unfamiliarity in any situation, I think, quite literally, that you're going into, not just as a jazz musician, but a musician in general. So in terms of risk-taking, I think that for me, that looks like trying things that I haven't tried before, whether that means, going for something harmonically or rhythmically, or kind of trying to conceptualize playing over a song in a different way. It sounds like small things, but in the moment, being open to trying something different and trying something new that you haven't done before can be scary for a lot of people, I think, at least.
For sure.
And you're doing it in front of however many people, and maybe with a band of people who you really admire. Right. So I think that element is always there. And the cool thing about that is when you do something, not every night, but maybe a few nights a week, or however often you're working, but when you're constantly, or consistently rather, taking risks like that, or trying something new in your day-to-day life, it really kind of opens you up to doing more and more things. And so that zone where you're really uncomfortable kind of becomes your comfort zone in a way.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a really cool thing.
I love it. Does that extend beyond the music, like getting into that zone of experimentation, risk taking? Do you find yourself taking risks, beyond music because you're in that kind of mindset?
I think I think it differs from person to person. Like it's funny, like I've played with so many people. I've played with people who are like totally shy and unassuming and very quiet and kind of, soft spoken. And then they get on stage and they're like total powerhouse players. So, it's like, and then it can go the other way too. Absolutely. So I think if you want that element of whatever the music gives you to come out in your personality, I think that it's there. And that's kind of the cool thing, like one really great example is I've read a bunch of times that Ella Fitzgerald was very, very shy off stage, very quiet, and she got on stage and she was a completely different person. So, sometimes music and performance gives us access to this part of ourselves that we didn't even know that we had. It can be buried so deep, or it can be somewhere so far back in the recess of our mind, and we don't even know it's there. So I think that, music in that sense and performance can really give us an inner strength in a lot of ways and can propel us, maybe just on stage, maybe not, but to take risks that we wouldn't otherwise take. So I think that that's really a cool thing.
Yeah, it reminds me, years ago I read about this study where a jazz musician was put under like a CAT scan while I think he was improvising on a digital piano, and every chamber in the brain lit up. And it just something about music and maybe improvisation.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're hardwired. Maybe there's kind of deep biological.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of thoughts on why that might be? What does it tell us about just being human?
I think it means that we love to be in the moment. I think that we strive for that, and I think that it can be hard for a lot of us in the society and world that we live in. We have so much to be anxious about. We have so many uncertainties just in the world that we live in. Period. And then it goes the other way too. We're also looking backwards a lot. There's a lot of things that have happened, I think, as a global society over the past couple of years that have given us a lot of reason to, feel this sense of sorrow or depression or sense of loss. And so I think all of us in some way are just kind of searching to be in this moment and not have to have that feeling of looking either backwards or forwards. And so, on a more spiritual sense, music and improvisation allows us to be in the moment. You have to be in the moment to improvise, because you're creating something spontaneously. So there's no looking back, hopefully, and there's no looking forward. Well, maybe looking forward, you have to do that a little bit. But I think there's something about that is very, very appealing to the human side of us. And then on top of that, it's just in a lot of ways, a very pure form of expression. It'd be, the same as when I was a kid, I loved just sitting down and coloring, right? And it's kind of the same thing. We're kind of doing the exact same thing when it comes to improvising. We're creating something in the moment, hopefully at the highest level, not judging ourselves for it. At least in the moment, we're not. We can look back after. But when we're playing, we're just there, and we're part of something larger, in my mind at least. And so that in itself is very freeing.
When I remember the first time I heard you play, I didn't realize it was you. It was shortly after the Rex had reopened after the pandemic, and I walked in the back door. And there were all these like COVID barriers, so I couldn't really see the stage, and there were people in front of me, and I heard this incredible saxophone player on stage until I was able to see the stage and realize, no, that's not that's Virginia playing clarinet, and went on to read how you growing up, having a dad who's a jazz musician, kind of had the sound of the clarinet in your mind, but that also you were captivated by the human voice, and trying to see if you can capture the beauty and nuances of the human voice with the clarinet. So maybe to conclude our session, would be wonderful if you'd be willing to provide a quick demonstration of how you uniquely have innovated with the clarinet and have kind of captured that human voice with your instrument.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to.
Perfect.
Yeah. So I have my clarinet here. So for me, what has been really, really important on my instrument is trying to cultivate the sound of a human voice as much as possible. I think what we're all trying to do at the end of the day as instrumentalists is sing through our instrument, and maybe some of us are not so blessed with natural vocal abilities, so we do it through whatever instrument we choose. So maybe what I can do is just try to play a couple of phrases, or I'll play one phrase and I'll play it a couple of different ways. And so the first way I'm going to play this is just very straight, kind of, no temperament, anything. Okay, so okay, so just very straight. I'm not really putting any inflection onto anything that I'm doing, and all of the notes are kind of even in terms of how I'm phrasing them, playing them. Okay, so if I put a little bit of temperament, maybe some personal inflection onto that. Okay, so when we think about inflection, there's a couple of things in a literal sense that we can think about that are going to mimic the sound of a human voice quite effectively. So there's things like vibrato, so having a waver to the end of the note, things like lifts into notes and bends into notes, so that might sound something like this. Okay, and so all of these things are going to kind of give what we do a more vocal quality to playing. Things like ornamentations. Right, so through all of these things, we're kind of aiming to get the most personal and unique sound that we can, whatever instrument it is we may be playing. And of course, the king of all of those things is sound, right? So, these are kind of things that you add on, or you kind of get into your playing at a certain point, but it all comes from the source, which is the sound that you're getting out of your instrument. And so a big part of that process for me was just listening to a lot of vocalists, trying to integrate some of what they were doing in terms of how they phrased things, how they sang a melody into my own playing.
That's wonderful. Virginia, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It's been a pleasure.